welcome to Torque Transferred, where we find uncommon perspectives to outrageous challenges. I am so grateful to be joined here by the one and only Chris Miller, aka Blacksmith, which we'll get into in a little bit. Before his story of being one of the first pair of boots on the ground after 9/11, Chris was just a kid who grew up in Iowa, which I can't wait to get into that. Chris, it's so great to have you today.
Joy, thanks for having me. Gosh, I'm going to ruin your entire broadcast. You've got this great legacy of having interesting people on here. Now you get me, and I have to use my classic. I totally have a face for radio. So thanks for having me on, though, and probably ruin. This will be the last broadcast anybody will ever listen to. But thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here. Hey, so you're the first generation quote unquote off the farm, right? Out of your family. Talk to me a little bit about how you grew up. What was Iowa like, and how did you go from potentially running the farm to not? What was that pivot for you?
Thankfully, my father, he was a Korean War veteran, an infantryman. He was drafted, came home, and went back to farming. And one morning, got up in the middle of winter, as many people that farm can appreciate. It's well below zero, and he has to go out and work in livestock. And he came back in and said to my mom, "We're moving to the city. I'm going to use my GI Bill and go to college." And that was the end of the Miller family farming legacy, and moved to Iowa City. And my dad was a civil servant. He was a cop and also a college professor for a while, and just kind of took the family in a different track. So I would spend my summers with my uncles who still farmed, and have great memories of Iowa in the summer and spring and fall. But winter, of course, is just, as you know, from being from the Midwest, where it's just brutal out there, where you can't. I would tell my kids, like, it gets so cold you whimper. I took them home one time. We left Washington, D.C. It was like 48 degrees when we left. We got to Iowa City, Iowa. I had them jump out of the van to run into the hotel. It was only about 30 yards. It was 20 something below zero, and I got inside and they're like, "Dad, you're right." I whimpered. So yeah, I'm glad to be out of the farming business.
You find a new depth of your soul in, like Midwest cold, right? I love it. What type of farm did your family have, by the way? Was it cattle or corn or
Hogs, corn, soybeans.
hogs, corn, soybeans? Okay. I grew up playing in we had a house and there was farms all around us. We didn't own them, but it was every other year. I love the corn years because I like playing in the corn stalks, because like my mom couldn't see me.
Oh yeah, and the crazy thing was,
yeah.
the responsibility they give you at a young age. My uncle didn't have keys for a tractor, obviously, but he said, "Okay, go do this, do that." And I'd be like, "How do I do this?" And he just expected you to figure it out. It was really, really serious developmental experience for me.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. A buddy of mine, with his kids, his brother actually still owns a farm, and he works on the hill. And him and his wife do this fantastic thing called Sweet and Sour Summers, where they send the kids to the farm for 6 weeks, and then the kids can come volunteer on Capitol Hill for the other 6. And I just I love it because it's context. Like, it's all hard work. It's just a different type of work. If anyone were to tell you, as you're growing up as this Iowa City kid, that one day you would be sitting in a presidential cabinet, what do you think you would have said at the time?
I would have laughed. Truly, only in America story. I laugh. I kind of tongue in cheek say that I'm the cabinet secretary that should have never been in the Oval Office, because normally the traditional national security experts take those slots. But honestly, and I'm not being political, it's just a statement of fact. So many of the conservative national security professionals signed those never Trump letters, and Trump and team actually paid attention to that. So that opened up open ocean for a bunch of us that normally would never be considered, and had the opportunity to serve at that level. But never in a million years. I was just a kid from Iowa. It's like, I need to get out of Iowa City. That's all I knew. And
yeah.
I joined the Army, and it's like, well, that's literally, they give you a plane ticket. You're like, what's this? I'd flown before, obviously, but they gave you a plane ticket like you're a travel agent. And there's like, hey, you need to go to Fort Jackson, South Carolina. Okay. And I just kind of fell in love with this, like, well, they pay you to travel and see the world. This is kind of a good deal.
I'm in. Excuse me. Did your father have any I mean, I'm sure he had impact on your life, obviously, like we all have. But did he push you to the military track, or was this something that was kind of you had multiple options, but you just decided Army was the way to go?
No, I come from a long line of draft dodgers and cowards. My family left Germany in 1848 to escape the draft. Those days where they were drafting everybody. So the family, skedaddled, came to the United States. My father was drafted, as I noted, but I don't come from a line of military people at all. My father really set an example about public service. He said there's intrinsic value in public service. And that kind of resonated with me. And that's kind of what our family business is now, public service, although my kids are all commercial entities, thank goodness. But we got a couple of generations of public service. But you have to remember too, Joy, growing up, I'm 56. Yeah, I'm 56. All my uncles, they had served in World War II, and it was during the Vietnam War, and just that whole thing just existed, kind of hung over every family gathering. And so there was this, wouldn't say expectation, but there was a history of that sort of service.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Who are you in one headline?
Whoa, you could have given me a heads up. I have to pull that. I have to just jump. All right, one headline.
Yeah, one headline.
Dedicated public servant who just tried to do his best and do his job for his nation. I'd probably follow up if you could give me how you have your main headline and then you always have that little thing underneath
what's your subtitle?
I'd like to think, good father, solid husband, and meaningful son, brother, etc.
Love it. I like that. I've spent a lot of time recently just engaging with folks like yourself that have had this, from my perspective, unbelievable professional career where to you it just feels like your life, right? And I've spent a lot of time asking a little bit more, not just on the professional side, but on the personal side. And I do find that when people prioritize the investment in both, they do make better decisions as leaders. It's a very interesting to me, and I appreciate the vulnerability to actually like share outside of the robotic like rip sheet, right? So no, so I appreciate that. I think your subtitle is equally important. So we met many years ago now, which is interesting because one of my dearest friends, my best friend from grad school, you were his group commander in the field, and I always heard about the infamous Chris Miller, one of the first pair of boots on the ground after 9/11. In that, I guess you guys, his name's John. You guys had reconnected during an Army 10 miler that John and I were actually running together, and you passed him and said something funny, like a joking, basically making fun of him because he's younger than you and you're running faster than him. And so I heard this like amazing, hilarious story about the infamous Chris Miller. So I kind of want to go back to that moment in time, not necessarily where you're John's group commander, but where you're truly the first pair of boots, on the ground. And then I want to hit, we had talked a little bit about 2003 and some of the lessons that you learned there. So I want to start there.
I can't let that one go, Joy. Come on.
Yeah.
So John, I was his battalion commander. John was just this remarkably talented Green Beret, younger, always spoke what was on his mind. We're doing, I think it was it Army 10 mile or the marathon? It doesn't make any difference. He's wearing his shirt from the scuba team that he was on.
There it is.
And obviously I'm like, I used to be in that battalion. So I didn't recognize John because when John was in the service, he was really, really built. He was like 220. and he'd been injured and he'd lost a lot of weight to manage because his back was bad. So so I saw his shirt and he goes, "Sir, you don't recognize me?" I just said, "No, I have no idea who you are." And then when he told me who he was, I started laughing, going, "Really? Did you think I would recognize you? You're like 50 pounds less than you were." But that was really, I got to tell you, that was just such a serendipitous encounter, which led, remember when we met, because I had no idea, people would call me at the Pentagon. They're like, "Oh, we've got this flex capacitor that we want to sell to special operations." And I didn't know whether they were just selling snake oil. So somebody goes, "You need to call Joy." I'm like, "Who's Joy?" "Boom Group." I'm like, "What's Boom Group?" And then were so really generous with your time and your insights, because I know when you're running a company, the last thing you want is somebody from the Pentagon going, "Hey, Joy, somebody's trying to sell me this. Can you look at it?" And you were kind of almost our tech assessor. So thanks for all of that. That was super, super helpful and super important. And here we are in torque transferred now. Who would have thunk it? What that was 4 years ago, I think
Yeah,
now.
it
Three,
was.
four
I
years.
was just starting out. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And
That
then
was,
we are talking Afghanistan.
yeah, yeah. So
Oh my,
yeah, let's flip there.
what's you're kid in Iowa, I read a lot, because there wasn't anything else to do. And that was still an era where you read. And I'd read all these books about Vietnam and World War II and whatnot. And I'd been in the Army. I enlisted in '83, but I'd been an officer and then with Special Forces in '93, and it's 2000 now. So I'd been in about 7 years. And I thought, if you're in the military, you kind of want to, go do your job, go do operations. And I thought I'd missed all my windows. Panama happened, Desert Storm happened, and I missed them all. It was in other assignments. And then lo and behold, I was in the 5th Special Forces Group, which is at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, and their area of responsibility. Each Special Forces Group has a different part of the world. Part of the world that we were responsible for was the Middle East. And right away, as soon as the attack went in, most of us realized it was bin Laden, that we were going to have a role in going to Afghanistan. So it was like, in a lot of ways, it was exactly what I joined the military for, to be involved in something like that. It's like so important to the nation. And to be able to be a spit actor in that thing was beyond, beyond a dream, I guess. It was just, the height of there's this, I'm talking too much, I know, Joy.
Oh,
The
no,
Good War by Studs Terkel. You did your time in Chicago, Studs Terkel, Chicago, whatever,
yeah,
Times or Tribune. He did oral history, and he did this thing one time about World War II called the Good War. It's kind of a
yeah,
parody. It's not a good war, but he would talk to all these mega wealthy people and senators and presidents, and they said, he'd ask them, what was the most important day of your life? And they'd all go, June the 6th, 1944, when they went ashore at D-Day, to take back Europe from the Nazis. And Studs Terkel would ask him, but come on, you were a senator, a president, a head of a huge organization. He said, nope, when I was a rifleman in the 1st Infantry Division. And I really, at the end of the day, that's the highlight of my professional career, was to be able to serve during that really, crazy critical period in our history.
yeah, yeah. No, I read Studs, so I went to some community college in Michigan before I went over to Chicago. I went to Columbia College Chicago, and basically like created this degree, which is now, people who know me, it's not shocking because this is what I do. But they didn't really have a poli-sci focus, but there was this award-winning professor who is amazing. And anyway, she made me read Studs, and that's what like really pivoted me from an advertising track to maybe this national security diplomacy track that I didn't quite know what it like looked like or smelled like. So yeah, I remember, I read his book. It was like orange cover, super thick. I will never forget that, but it was a lot of fun. So, hey, I've been talking a lot about the founders fight lately, which is interesting, and it's inspired by you actually, because I interviewed you a little over a year ago for my TED Talk. And I was breaking down, can you actually train for conviction and have a warrior mindset, right? And you had told me this story, which we won't get into for this episode, but the takeaway of the story was that movement, movement in combat is safer than being static, right? And as a combat sport person myself, I know this to be true, because if you're standing in one spot, your results is pretty much given to you. You're gonna get punched in the face or shot, right? Like that's what's happening if you're in combat. If we're static, the fate and odds are pretty much guaranteed. And I think a lot of times in this fight, if it's the national security fight, a business fight, whatever fight you're personally in, the hardest thing to do is to decide to make a move, like that moment where you're assessing, understanding, and then deciding to act. So, with that kind of framework, I want to talk a little bit about 2003 and the Iraq invasion. I had asked you in preparation, what is the problem you're most proud of solving, or like this moment in time that was epically against, that the odds were not in your favor. And I want you to break down for us 2003 Iraq.
I think back, that was kind of my magnum opus. And I always talk about we. It's not about me. It's not about I. But on that one, the scheme I came up with, if that thing would have gone bad and they did the investigation, yours truly would have been on the blame line, and rightfully so. My bosses would have taken responsibility because they were good bosses, but it was my idea. The issue was special forces go behind enemy lines. That's what they do, and do reconnaissance of key terrain, or look at enemy forces and the key places where something could go bad for the conventional forces that are part of the attack. They were driving up through the river valley. We wanted to get ahead of them so that we could give them some kind of information and warning about what was going on. The issue was no one could cross into Iraq prior to the start of the war. And the challenge was, okay, that kind of negates the purpose of special forces if we're not going to be able to go in early. Usually you go in a couple days early so that you can start reporting. I'd been in the Army at that point. That was 2003. So, 14, 15 years. And for me, that was the first time where they talk about being in the zone or being in the flow, I guess they call it, where you're just like information, like your synapses are just like crackling and firing, and you can see into the future, and everything just comes together. And that was the first time I really experienced it at that level. And I look back now on it and I realize, like, all of my training, my education, all that reading I did on my own, all the self-study, all the listening and talking to people, came together and came to the conclusion. I was back at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. We just got back from Afghanistan. We'd been given the order, you're going into Iraq. The second battalion, I was in 3rd Battalion, 5th Special Forces Group, and our job was to be the reserve. And nobody wants to be the reserve. Like, oh, we're just going to sit here on our hands. So I came up with a mission that we would take the battle into Baghdad. The idea was we had to jump ahead. There was no way we could just ride along with the tanks and everything else. We're like, that's not a special forces mission. So I looked at the map, and when the Iranians took our hostages at the embassy in Tehran, what was that, 78, 79, and we tried to rescue them in 79. It was we failed. And it was such an important defining experience in my young life to see the American military fail. And what happened was we flew helicopters and C-130 fixed wing propeller driven planes into the desert, and we landed them there, and we failed because one of the helicopters crashed into one of the C-130s, and the operation had to be aborted because there were so many casualties. And I thought about that, and I was like, I think we can fly into Iraq and get behind enemy lines, and then we can have our special operations C-130s, they're called MC-130s, full of trucks. They can land in the desert, and the trucks can roll off, and then they can go up to the key terrain and the key choke points that the conventional forces wanted us to look at. So that was my crazy idea. And lo and behold, I wrote down, I had gone to this, I had become, Joy, everybody's going to laugh at me. When I was younger, they made me be the logistics officer, the supply officer. That's like the worst job in special forces. I get assigned this task, and my boss was like, you need to learn something beyond just special forces. You need to expand your knowledge base. And I was like, oh man, no, I'm good. And I really thought about leaving the service at that point.
Wow.
That job, the logistics officer is responsible for movement. I had to go to this school called Air Mobility School, where they teach, it was this, you had to memorize every aircraft and how much weight it could take and all this stuff. I sat and on the back of a 3x5 card, jotted down the concept and what we needed. Lo and behold, go to the Air Force, and we ended up in Kuwait. I said, this is what we want to do. I had the intel people. I said, find us a place to land. They found 2 places and put together a plan that we'd fly behind enemy lines, and we did it, and it worked. And it was a little nerve-wracking at first, but that to me was like the moment where all of those experiences and all that knowledge and all just came together, and kind of did something that had never been done before in special operations. At least, there are several different types of special operations, but just vanilla plain special forces, and kind of changed the parameters and dynamics of the battle.
How did you build a small group of supporters to your idea? Because obviously, in particular, in any security operation, there's a lot of equities, right? There's acquisition requirements, intel, security, diplomacy. Like, there's a lot of people who could have said no and probably had a viable reason to say no, right? Backed by data. So how did you overcome that and build, a small group of people to say yes that enabled you to pull it off?
I would like to think it was because of my innate genius. Now, that's not it at all. And it was just, you hit the nail on the head. There was opportunity here because the main fight was in 1991, the Iraqis had used Scud missiles to launch into Israel. So the major task for Special Forces, the unit I was in, was to go into Western Iraq to make sure that the Iraqis could not, shoot missiles into Israel. So the interesting thing was we were kind of forgotten about, the battalion I was in. So I was able to build a coalition between the intelligence community, the Air Force special operators, and everybody. And probably wouldn't have happened if we were the center of attention, because like you said, too many stakeholders would have been like, that is wacky, Miller. Absolutely not. I had a great boss too, who was supportive of it. And the story's, I think, hilarious, but I'm not going to bore you with it. But yeah, we got it approved. I would like to say, you brought up an interesting point. Decision support tools didn't really have them then. Now you could throw a lot of brain power and analytics at it, probably come up with, risk calculus and all that. This one was from the gut and got approved. It was touch and go, but we pulled it off.
I think that those analytics tools, they're our greatest blessing and our greatest curse. Because I think, when they work well, it ends up being a velocity game, right? So speed in the right direction. It's like, take everything in, make the choice, go. And it can be backed by data. But on the flip side, where I've seen almost like a completely frozen ability to make a decision, is because there's so much coming in that you can then enter like a new calculus, and so I think they're a great thing. I think the defense industrial base has made, leaps and bounds, especially in commercial tech and what it can do for security. But on the flip side, I do think that there's an opportunity now to overlay, that ability to aggregate data and actually get it ingested in our decision process. And I don't think that we've really cracked that yet.
Ender's Game's like one of the best kind of preparatory, and that was one of the books I read, in preparation for going in or into special forces. And they had this, they literally had the AI algorithm that can parse through 10,000 years of battles and whatnot, and come up with a range of scenarios. But we're definitely not there yet. And I wonder how that would have affected, because it can become, as it can become an excuse not to do something like, gee, our dunkulator says that this has a 75% chance of failure, which I think this one probably would have. No, it wasn't rash. And you know what I did, Joy? I asked like the non-commissioned officers, the sergeants that have been in special forces 20 years. I was like, that was always my touchstone. I go to them, I'm like, hey, is this a stupid idea? Sometimes they'd be like, that is batshit, do not do that. I'm like, thanks. But this one, I ran it by a whole bunch of people and they said, yeah, we can do this. So that was but we didn't have analytics helping us at all.
Yeah. So in terms of like the common themes that I see in this 2003 Iraq story, one, teamwork for sure, and not accepting hey, you're the backup, and you're like, well, we're actually just not going to sit on the sidelines. So how do I build this like coalition of the willing, right? In a support team that doesn't take away from the core objective. So I think that's really interesting. The second thing that I'm hearing from you is you did have a vision for whatever reason. You like had this moment where all these things just came together for you. And you're like, I see it. It's exactly what we need to do. And I think a lot of times people will have vision, but they don't have the courage to speak up, because what if I'm wrong? What if I fail? Right? And in war and in security operations, it's obviously there's a lot higher stake at risk because we're talking about human life, right? So I understand why somebody may be propelled to speak up in that moment or kind of hold their cards closer. So teamwork and vision. And then the third thing that's interesting to me is once those things came online and you built this coalition of the willing, you actually had the opportunity to execute and see it through. And I actually think that that's a very special thing to be able to experience and then apply and replicate, because a lot of times the environment will, it pitch us something that we're not seeing or we didn't anticipate, and all of a sudden, Mack truck is running you over. You're like, well, didn't get to the execution standpoint because of this environmental factor. So I think it's really special that teamwork, vision, and execution were actually able to happen. I want to pivot to, we're 21 years past 9/11. A lot of the conversations that I've been in lately have been about how everything is broken, how acquisition is broken, how intel is broken, how requirements is broken, how security operations is broken, how diplomacy is broken. All these pillars that make American diplomacy and democracy occur. Everybody just tells me how dire it is, and it's pretty depressing, right? A lot of books that have come out, 2034 is one of them. Again, a dire state of, if we don't solve this thing, then we're all going down the toilet. And I just don't believe that at face value, because I think that we've gotten to this point because a lot of willing and courageous Americans. But I also don't want to be naive as a leader, right? So did you I'm sure you've read or watched Charlie Wilson's War. Yeah. So Charlie Wilson's War is like my personal mantra right now, and I'm spending a lot of time kind of dissecting it. And at the end of the movie, the screen goes black, and there's this quote in white letters, and it says, "And then we effed up the end game." Right. And I don't want that to be the case for our country and our world, in terms of what do the next 20 years of security operations look like. So my question to you is, given all that you've seen and been a part of both in the field and in commercial industry and in public service, do you think that ending is inevitable? Do you think it's inevitable?
Geez, we ought to just all walk off into the swamp if that's the case. No, I think we have agency, and I'm with you. My wife had a great line the other day. She said, the whole problem is this. And I was like, all right, that's a little dramatic, but there is something to be said about our attention deficit disorder. I was just going to say, Joy, we're ready for transformation. There's nothing wrong with that. The nature of our country is we kind of refresh, and we, the institutions and process and bureaucracy and tools and procedures that have worked in the past have to be updated. And I think we're at that place right now. Remember, the last time we updated the national security architecture was, I think it was 87, 88. It was called Goldwater-Nichols, where, the joint force was created, and it really was exceptionally successful, at least with war fighting. I think we could argue about war termination. We have some issues about how we need to train, educate, and select people that can do that better, because we do not have a good track record since World War II with war termination, where we kind of lost. So yeah, I'll put Korea in the tie column. I think that's going to go for a W someday.
Yeah.
I mean, that's been 70 years. So I'm kind of like, I think we're ready for transformation. We can do that. The problem is the forces of resistance, and this is not it's not conspiratorial, and I'm not being negative on the current system where we have 5 major defense contractors. That's the incentive system that we've established as the American people, and we've allowed that, and it's been successful. But I think that in the future, we really have to decentralize, because you know this better than anybody. Back in the day when DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, invented the internet and GPS and everything else, and truly was the mover, the driver of technological change. Those days are gone. That happens in the private industry. And I think we just need to flip it again. And we can do that. We have agency. We're going to have to get Congress involved. And as we always know, stakeholders that have an incentive to go with the status quo are going to fight like heck. But at the end of the day, Joy, we can't continue to pay $1.25 trillion a year on national defense. And my thing is, we're going back to the era of quantity over quality. We see it with unmanned systems, uncrewed systems, I refer to them as. I think we're in a bit of a transformation of how we do war fighting, and we'll get there. But your point is, there used to be this horrible cliche during the Cold War, fight tonight. Like, America has this tradition of always losing the first battle. And there was the whole thing was, we can't lose the first battle this time because the future of the Republic as it is at stake. I kind of think we're there now,
Yeah.
where, but by the same token, Joy, we still have two massive oceans, and the geography of the United States really lends itself to perhaps we have the ability to change our strategic approach for a bit and maybe kind of retool and take some time to figure this out.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think so too. I've enjoyed looking at the history of all the defense contractors. I come from a big acquisition background, so it's natural for me to go to acquisition to look for lessons. And I think it's interesting that the majority of the big defense contractors really are in a pretty deep vertical, right? Like no other company other than Lockheed Martin is going to build the F-35, period. Like it's just not. There's way too much complication, and obviously there's other providers within the F-35. Pratt does the engine, all these different things. But at the end of the day, the vertical pillars of the defense industrial base are pretty much there. And I think, it appears to me that a lot of folks are pushing on these pillars, saying the pillars are broken, whether that's public or private. And I really want to urge folks at every leadership level to just accept that those pillars are the pillars. Like we have our verticals, it's fine, and actually look for opportunities to pull, small businesses, medium-sized enterprises through horizontally, through, artificial intelligence, through policy, through decision making, but think more this way versus, these stagnant pillars that just have to be there. And I don't quite know the answer yet. And I don't know what it looks like from a policy perspective or an industry's perspective, but I'm excited to figure it out. One final question for you, Chris. While I have you here, if you had one challenge to, the next generation of public servants specifically, what would that be? What's one thing that you would urge public servants to focus on?
Gosh, that's a great one. Another one, you threw that at me, and I don't have like a quick response. I'm just what troubles me more, to tell you the truth, than the national security situation is the fact that people are losing faith in their government, and I really find our current political leadership, and I guess we could go beyond that. In the past, great leaders always were developing the next generation, and I really don't see that right now. With the current generation of baby boomers, they're all in their 80s. I'm not criticizing people that are older, but by the same token, I see them not being. Can you tell me who the next generation of political leaders are right now? I can't tell you, and I think that's really important. And all right, I'm going to go conspiratorial on you.
Do it.
I think there's a vested interest in the current generation of leaders to maintain the status quo as long as they can. And part of that is to basically, they want to replicate themselves. And I think we're ready for a new generation. We are ready for a new generation that, that's a little more technologically enabled. And I got a lot of hope. My kids, and they're in their 20s. This sounds beyond cliche, right? You got to end it with a cliche about, oh, it's for the kids. I'm not saying that, but they're enormously talented and they really, really care. I just think we need to clear the water for the next generation. And that's kind of where I am right now. There's innate goodness and decency in public service. And we need the best people to go in there. It's kind of hard when, you can go to Wall Street and make, enormous amount of money. I'd love to get back to that tradition where we have people that do public service and then go into private industry and kind of go back and forth. And, we talked in the past, we used to have this thing, it's public-private partnerships. I'm enough with that. Let's do private-public, because I think the real energy right now is in the private sector, but they need to be mobilized. Those folks, they want to contribute. We saw that in Afghanistan last year. Joy, you led the way with a bunch of other people that said, hey, the government's not getting the job done, so we're going to go ahead and do our part. And I thought that was a real example for me and gave me a tremendous hope about how we actually can come together. I get this question all the time, well, what are we talk about September 11th, 2001, where, there really was like America came together. Maybe I'm like hallucinating about it, but that's what I remember. People ask, well, how can we do this again? And I think I think we have the ability to recommit. Maybe it's the environment, maybe it's something else, but I also think we can recommit to, reinforcing, kind of transforming the nature of our democracy. So that sounds probably really pie in the sky, but that's where I am, and that's what I'm going to continue to do until my last breath or until I lose my mind, whichever comes first.
I love it. I love it. No, I think you're spot on. And every few generations, the greatest generation comes along. If you look historically from, way, way, way back, right? I mean, 1700 still now. You can see based on the environment, how people choose to respond, how they come together. And I do think for what it's worth that you are doing your part. I've been at very fancy events where you and I are in the same room with all the the who's and to dos and all the stars on people's sleeves. And what I appreciate most about you is that you go out of your way to find people like me and my colleagues to say, hey, this is Joy, meet this person, here's what they're about, and actually bridging that gap between leaders and generations. And so, if more people could go out of their way to do that and look people up and connect them to the conversation so that they have the opportunity to assess it, make a decision, and execute, I think that our country would be way better off for it. So I
Let's
appreciate
do it. What the heck? What do we got
what
to
the heck?
lose?
Let's do it.
No, thanks for the kind words, but more importantly, thanks for being a thought leader and caring, and that's what we just need more of, and we'll get there.
Yeah, I think so. Chris, thanks so much for joining us today. I'll talk to you soon. Welcome.